My parents accuse me of killing my brother and want to sentence me to prison. My husband intervened. I never thought I'd see the day when my own parents would look at me with such cold, accusatory eyes. Growing up, my family had been close-knit. My older brother, Michael, and I had shared everything from childhood secrets to teenage rebellion, and my parents had been the warm, guiding force behind us. But now, standing in my parents' living room, the same place where we'd celebrated countless birthdays and holidays, I was met with an unimaginable hostility. The nightmare began 2 months ago, on a stormy night that still haunts my memory. Michael, who had always been the adventurous one, was driving back from a camping trip in the mountains. I'd warned him about the weather, how the news had said there were flash floods in the area, but Michael had brushed it off, saying he'd driven in worse. Hours later, I got a call from the hospital. There had been an accident. Michael's car had swerved off a cliff road and crashed into the rocks below. He hadn't survived. The grief that swallowed me in the days following his death was suffocating. My husband, Daniel, was my rock, helping me through the days when even getting out of bed seemed impossible. But that grief was nothing compared to the shock I felt when I realized my parents didn't just blame me for Michael's death, they believed I was responsible. The accusations started subtly at first. My mother would make passing remarks about how I'd always led Michael astray or pressured him to live on the edge. My father, usually reserved, would glare at me during family gatherings, his eyes shadowed with suspicion. I tried to brush it off, thinking that maybe grief was twisting their perceptions. But as the days passed, the remarks grew sharper, more pointed. One evening, they asked me to come over to their house. Daniel insisted on coming with me, sensing that something felt wrong, but I assured him I could handle it. When I arrived, my parents sat me down in the living room, their expressions stern and unyielding. "Rebecca," my mother began, her voice as cold as ice, "we need to talk about Michael's death." I nodded, expecting to share in her grief. But then my father spoke. "You were the last person to talk to him, weren't you?" His words took me by surprise. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "He called to let me know he was on his way back." My mother's face twisted, and she leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Did you tell him to take the cliff road?" "What? No," I stammered, feeling my heart race. "Why would I do that? I warned him about the storm." "Enough, Rebecca," my father interrupted. His voice was low and steady, a tone I'd never heard from him before. "We've thought a lot about this, and it doesn't add up. You were the last person he spoke to. You're the one who's always pushed him to take risks. And now he's dead." The words hit me like a physical blow. You think I'm responsible? That I caused his accident?" I could barely get the words out, my voice shaking with disbelief. "We don't just think, Rebecca," my mother said, her voice trembling with anger. "We know. You were jealous of him, of everything he achieved. You've always been competitive, always trying to be better than him. And now that he's gone, you get to be the only child left." I stared at them, speechless, feeling as though I were trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare. That's not true. I loved Michael. He was my brother." "Then explain why the police found a second set of fingerprints on the back of his car, fingerprints that match yours," my father said, his eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. My mind spun. I had no idea what they were talking about. I hadn't been near Michael's car since before he left for his trip. How could my fingerprints have been there? I opened my mouth to defend myself, to say something, anything that might convince them, but nothing came out. My mother rose from her chair, her face a mixture of grief and anger. "We can't let this go, Rebecca. We can't let you get away with this. We've contacted the authorities. They're opening an investigation. If you had any part in this, we'll make sure you pay for what you've done." I could barely breathe as I stumbled out of the house, the weight of their accusations pressing down on me. When I got home, I was shaking, and Daniel was waiting for me in the doorway, his face etched with concern. Without a word, I collapsed into his arms, sobbing. "Rebecca," he said softly, holding me tightly. "What happened?" "They think I killed Michael," I whispered, barely able to believe the words myself. The next few days were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and fear. My parents didn't just stop with their accusations, they began gathering so-called evidence, twisting every detail to fit their narrative. They contacted the police, convinced that I'd somehow tampered with Michael's car, and provided statements about my supposed jealousy and competition with him. I felt as if I were being pulled under, unable to fight back against their distorted view of reality. Daniel, however, refused to let me face it alone. He was furious, more so than I'd ever seen him. "This is absurd," he said, pacing back and forth in our living room. "They're grieving, yes, but this is beyond grief. They're trying to ruin your life, Rebecca." "I don't know why they're doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's like they want to punish me, to make me suffer for something I didn't do." Daniel stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression resolute. "Then we'll fight this. We'll prove them wrong." True to his word, Daniel threw himself into uncovering the truth. He contacted lawyers, investigators, and even tried to reason with my parents, who refused to listen to him. They were determined to see me behind bars, convinced that I was guilty. It was as if they had transformed into strangers, people blinded by a grief so intense that they couldn't see reason. As the investigation went on, the police conducted interviews, gathered evidence, and even examined Michael's car. The initial fingerprint evidence my parents had cited was circumstantial at best. The prints they'd mentioned were partial, found near the passenger door, and could have been there from any previous encounter. But my parents were relentless, pressuring the detectives, calling constantly, pushing for charges to be filed. In a stroke of luck, Daniel found a private investigator, a retired detective named Max, who agreed to take on the case. Max was thorough, and after weeks of combing through evidence, he uncovered something shocking. "Rebecca," he said one evening, sitting across from me and Daniel in our living room, "I have reason to believe that Michael's accident wasn't an accident at all." I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean?" Max hesitated, then looked at me with a mixture of pity and sadness. "I don't think your parents are as innocent as they seem." "What?" Daniel's voice was filled with disbelief. Max explained that my parents had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Michael just a few weeks before his trip. Michael had been their pride and joy, their perfect child, the one they believed would bring them success. But unbeknownst to me, Michael had been planning to move across the country, distancing himself from them. They'd hoped he would stay close, fulfill their expectations. The insurance policy was their backup plan, a way to profit from their golden child, whether he lived up to their dreams or not. It was a horrific realization. My parents hadn't been blaming me out of grief, they had been trying to cover their own tracks, painting me as the villain to deflect suspicion from themselves. Armed with this evidence, Daniel and I confronted the police, who reopened the investigation. Slowly, the truth began to emerge, and my parents' web of lies unraveled. They'd been so blinded by their own greed and anger that they were willing to sacrifice me to protect their twisted narrative. When the charges were finally brought against them, I felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, sorrow, and betrayal. These were the people who had raised me, who I had loved and trusted, now exposed for the monsters they truly were. In the end, it was Daniel's unwavering support, his belief in my innocence, and his determination to uncover the truth that saved me. My parents were sentenced for their crime, leaving a painful void in my life, a scar that would never fully heal. But I was free to move forward, to rebuild. With Daniel by my side, I knew I could face whatever lay ahead.